Welcome to Renegade Inc. Before COP26, Prince Charles revealed his eco-credentials, stating that his Aston Martin is fine because it runs on cheese and wine. Surely a climate Marie Antoinette moment. Suspiciously absent from the COP26 talking shop was the word degrowth. But unless you're actively talking about degrowth, you're just peddling corporate, political, and billionaire propaganda. Jason Hickel, welcome to Coconomics. Degrowth. When Roman Kusnarek was here, he said something to us that we should say to you. Quite why I wouldn't say it directly, but here goes.
Please.
He said, when you speak to Jason about degrowth, can you please get him to stop using the word degrowth? Now, I'm sure you've heard this argument lots of times. And Noam Chomsky's also said it, hasn't he? And as has Naomi Klein. What does that word do to people? It sort of has a Pavlovian effect. People go, what? Degrowth?
Yes, that's right.
Hang on. That means, because all we hear all the time and what you're fighting is growth, quarter on quarter growth. And you come along and suddenly say, degrowth. This is the way forward. Less is more. Why does that word have such a connotation?
It's interesting. I like Roman, although you're right. He should have said this to me personally, but it's fine. Now,
I'm sorry to hijack you with it.
Look, I didn't invent the term. It has a deep grounding in social movements, actually, and so we should acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And it's very clearly defined in the academic literature, which is simply that it's a planned reduction of resource and energy throughput in high-income nations, conducted in a safe, just, and equitable way that improves social outcomes. And so it's distinct from, say, a recession. We have different words because they're different things. Now, it's also intended to be a challenging word in the sense that it goes to the very core of our deepest assumptions about how the economy should work, right. Namely growth, and forces us into a reckoning, right? And this creates antagonism, but it also creates difficult conversations that need to be had. Right. And we learn through that process, right? We learn through being challenged. That being said, I definitely don't advocate that the term should always be used in every context. I think that people can make their own decisions about when to use the term. A politician at the podium might choose to not use the term intersectionality because it's not known by most people and may be confusing. Similarly, they might choose not to use the term degrowth and take a different kind of framing like George Monbiot's public luxury or donut economics or something like that. Although we would want to insist that there's also a reckoning with the growth dependency with whatever path you take. The crucial thing is that the policies are enacted. And those policies are policies to scale down destructive parts of the economy, while at the same time ensuring robust, high quality public provisioning for all. So taking key social goods out of the market effectively. That does not mean that you close down the market entirely.
Right.
There are plenty of, commodity production can and should continue. There are plenty of realms of provisioning that should be provided by the market in a non-capitalist way. Markets without capitalism. But we want to reverse that core feature of capitalism, which is to de-enclose the commons and ensure that everyone has access to the means of survival. When people hear the word capitalism, they often think, that's just markets and trade and businesses and so on, right. Which is not true, given that markets and trade were around for thousands of years before capitalism. Capitalism is a new system, only 500 years old. And what distinguishes it from all other economic systems in history is that it is it's organized around the enclosure of the means of survival, right? Be that originally through the enclosure movement, the land, but also now, energy, water, healthcare, education, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. There's perpetual enclosure of what we need to survive.
Therefore, under the banner of privatization.
That's right. Privatization is the form that enclosure takes in the modern economy.
And what happens with the word privatization? It comes with a little friend, which is called Tina.
That's right.
It's because there is no alternative. And these things both arrive at the same time mysteriously.
Yeah, and so the consequence of this basically is that people don't have any way of surviving except for selling themselves to be exploited by capital in return for wages. So human existence, the human enterprise itself, is subordinated to the interests of capital. And therefore we end up with a system that, where production is organized not around meeting human needs. In fact, human needs are quite often sabotaged The object in capitalism is to facilitate capital accumulation and elite appropriation of labor and resources. So that's what we need to reverse, and we reverse that with the social guarantee that effectively de-encloses the commons. This is not, again, as you say, this is not a vision of austerity. In fact, let's recognize that austerity is a child of capitalism.
Yes.
Austerity is a child of growthism, right? When you have a growth-addicted capitalist economy that must perpetuate capital accumulation, then you have to sabotage and privatize and enclose, which is the misery that is induced in the US and Britain and Western Europe increasingly today. So degrowth calls for the opposite. It calls for a kind of radical abundance where we all have access to what's necessary for a flourishing life.
And that is based on a natural law principle, isn't it? Insofar as there is abundance out there, the nature provides. Once you start to enclose the commons, once you start to privatize, once you start to enact land monopoly, once you start to extract the rents, ultimately you end up with the situation that we've got now, which is apparent progress, but on the flip side, all this poverty, all the environmental degradation, and of course the mass iniquity, you could go as far as saying, that comes with it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and when it comes to the question of progress, we should be clear about where progress actually comes from, right? There's this strange narrative out there that says that social progress, improvements in social outcomes, are sort of the spontaneous gift of capital accumulation, right?
Right.
As though it's kind of handed down to us by capital somehow. But no, this is not true. If you look historically, progress has always been won through progressive social movements, anti-colonial struggles, labor unions, et cetera, et cetera. The empirical record is very clear that these are the drivers of progress.
Yes.
Quite often against the interests of the capitalist class, who don't want to give those concessions.
Right.
So yes, I mean, we can have social progress without capitalism. In fact, it's easier to have social progress without capitalism because you're not fighting a constant uphill battle.
Yes.
Right. You don't have to constantly fight capital at every, through the media, through the political system at every turn. So that's, I think, crucial to this vision.
Not fighting, ultimately there will be a fight, but picking your battles and fighting strategically, because let's face it, whether it's the capture of the political system, capture of the media, capture of the think tanks, capitalists have been excellent, well organized, and they often agree on an awful lot.
Yes.
And you can't say that about the left, if we're going to take that example. How do you strategically pick those battles? How do you appeal to hearts and minds? And how do you get that constituency behind you who've understood your argument and realised that if we don't change course now, this super tanker is going to crash? Yeah.
So, yes, you're absolutely right. This requires a struggle. Let's not.
Excuse me, because we can't shy away from it. If we're Panglossian about it and say, well, you know what, they're all going to wake up one morning and just see our logic.
That's right. Yes.
Well, good luck.
Well, for example, take degrowth, for example, right? It is so well researched in the academic literature.
Yeah.
Thousands of scientists have been at work for several decades, demonstrating the imperative of this. And so the logic is there. It's not like we lack evidence,
Right. The logic's there. Now the strategic battle.
That's right. And so, you're absolutely right. It's not like, the powers that be are going to just agree to this voluntarily, because they have very significant material interests at stake, let's put it that way. And so you have to have a strategy.
That was very diplomatically put.
And right now, there's no strategy. The best we have is the environmentalist movements, which I support, and they do an excellent job to the extent that they're able. But they're limited in several respects. First of all, they tend not to have a sufficiently robust critique of the fact that it is capitalist growth that is ultimately driving this problem, right? They think of it in terms of individual consumption and behavior change, et cetera, which is not going to fly. Right. We have to understand this is ultimately, the crisis we face is being driven by the production system, which is organized around perpetual expansion. Overconsumption in the West, in rich countries, is an effect of the production system. Capitalism is constantly overproducing and then has to find a way to absorb all of that overproduction to maintain value, basically. So I think we have to recognize here that growth is a deeply ideological term. right? I mean, think about it. If you were a capitalist, maybe you are secretly, and if
That's
you
my
wanted
side hustle, by the way.
yeah, if you wanted to sell your system to the people, then you would sell it on the grounds of it's going to generate growth.
Yes.
Growth is a phenomenally positive, powerful term. Children grow, plants grow, everything good grows, it would seem, obviously to a limit. We don't talk about that part. So it's like, as Timothy Mitchell has put it, it is the alibi of capital, right? So if capitalism, entails processes of exploitation and extraction, which we might actually not agree with, it can sort of get us to buy into the broader project by saying, oh no, it's giving us growth, and growth is equivalent to progress, which is of course not true. So, and what's interesting is, they talk about expanding the pie. What pie is being expanded here?
Right.
The pie that's being expanded is the pie of commodity production, not the pie of use value or provisioning. So what really matters to us is access to the resources we need to live well, which may entail, for example, a public health service. Now, if you were to privatize the U.S. health service, if you were to nationalize,
It's already done.
It's already done.
It's already done.
If you were to nationalize the U.S. health service, taking that public good out of the market,
Yes.
GDP would decline.
Yes.
And yet our access to this crucial use value that is essential to all of our lives would improve. Our health outcomes would improve. Our sense of well-being and happiness would improve. And so there's quite often a disjuncture between GDP growth and provisioning and well-being. And that should be an empowering realization for us. We can improve provisioning and use value without additional growth.
What's the problem with GDP as a metric? Because now, and I'm sure this wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago, now, whenever we hear that, we think, actually, we don't need more growth. This GDP thing, it's sending us down the wrong track.
Yeah.
What's the problem with it?
Well, the problem with GDP is that, first of all, we should be clear what it is. It's not a measure of use value or provisioning or well-being, which is the way it's often used as a proxy, basically. It is a metric of commodity production as measured in terms of prices. And it does not count the social or ecological costs of commodity production. So if you tear down a forest and sell the timber to IKEA, then GDP goes up, but it doesn't account for the ecological costs of that. This is not to say that commodity production is not useful, and in some cases may even need to grow. But we should be rational and say, as Kuznets himself warns, let's always ask growth for what end and for what purpose and for whose benefit.
Now, he devised the system, didn't he?
He's the one that devised GDP in the 1930s. That's
and
right.
then spent the rest of his career saying, oh no, I've created a monster.
Yeah, he spent the rest of his career warning about it, basically, saying,
what have I done?
We should always be asking, what is being produced? Who has access to it? And how is the income from that being distributed? These are the questions we need to be asking. And so let's focus on producing things that we actually need. Let's make sure that people who need them have access to them rather than enclosing and privatizing them. And let's ensure that the income generated from commodity production is shared fairly.
Jason Hickel, welcome back to Renegade Inc. Always great to have you. Less is More is our book of the week this week. We want you to pitch it to us. Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. That's the tagline. Go.
So, thanks, Ross. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to situate the arguments for a post-growth and degrowth economy in the context of the broader history of capitalism, and really unites consciousness about the environmental crisis with consciousness about how our capitalist system works. And in the end, I offer sort of a pathway with solutions toward a kind of post-capitalist economy. I also consider questions of ontology, like the deeper philosophical questions that underpin our relationship with nature and how capitalism has affected that and where that came from in the history of capitalism. So that's it. And
happy ending, tragic ending.
I tried to make it hopeful, but let me put it this way.
Go.
Hope is important. So people always want to ask me, do we have hope? And we do have hope, and hope sustains us. But I also want to say that our hope can only ever be as strong as our struggle. We can't be naive about what is required of us in the face of ecological breakdown and accelerating capitalist crisis. So we need a movement that's commensurate to the task, and that's not easy to build.
Books change authors. What did you think about, or what assumptions did you hold at the beginning of writing Less is More? And what changed your mind, or what did you change, transition through the book when you finished writing it, if I can put it like that?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that I've learned a lot from my critics, actually. And so I'm on social media, which is
that's a terrible idea.
Which is terrible. Yeah,
terrible idea.
It is terrible. But what has been useful for me is that it's given me a chance to field all of the best arguments of those who are skeptical of this position.
Give us the top three that you hear with monotonous regularity. Give us the top three about degrowth.
Well, there are several. So first of all, people will say, "Oh, that sounds like you're preventing poor countries from growing."
Right.
And this is definitely not true. Degrowth is very explicit that this is a demand for reducing resource use and energy use in rich countries. In fact, what's important to note here is that growthism in rich countries relies on forms of imperialist appropriation from the global south.
Explain that, because people will hear that and go, yeah, but what?
So historically, we all know that the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and Europe's economic rise depended fundamentally on appropriation of resources and labor from the global south. Think of several hundred years of mass enslavements. Think of where the cotton and sugar that fueled the Industrial Revolution came from, not from England, let's put it that way.
You can't argue it.
It emerged from the colonial process.
Yes.
Colonialism and capitalism have always been united together. Yes. Their histories are coterminous. Now, political decolonization was accomplished in most of the world in the middle of the 20th century, but scholars argue that these basic relations of appropriation continue to operate in the world economy through various forms of unequal exchange, whereby we can trace empirically a net flow of resources and embodied labor in traded goods from south to north.
Right.
A large net flow.
Right.
We're talking about a significant portion of global south productive activity is organized around capital accumulation in the global north. Right. And so growth has this imperial dimension to it. Growth in the north has this imperial dimension to it, which causes immense ecological and social harm in the global south, undermining struggles for improvements in social outcome and development, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
And so if we are going to be anti-imperialists, we have to start questioning growthism in the global north. And I would say that that progressives must be anti-imperialism, otherwise our progressivism is worth nothing.
2, what's the second argument that you hear to try and defeat degrowth?
So another one people will say is, well, that sounds like austerity or voluntary impoverishment, et cetera. So no, I mean, this assumption that degrowth somehow will lead to like a regression in social improvement is premised on the assumption that growth and social improvement are linked, which we know for a fact they are not. There's no reason that an expansion in commodity production should have any causal relationship with social outcomes, certainly not beyond a certain point. And we know for a fact that we can achieve very high levels of social well-being with moderate levels of GDP.
Done.
Good.
Recognized. Second one, recognized. Third one.
The third one is that people will say, well, okay, maybe we do need degrowth, a planned reduction of resource and energy use, but it's not politically feasible. Now,
sorry.
And
the helplessness, you can hear it. Oh, wow.
And look, I agree. I agree that the politics of this are hard. But this is not about the masses, resisting it. Once we get past the ideology of growth, that is not a problem. Once people recognize that what we're proposing here in an eco-social economy is will actively improve the lives of most people. Certainly the working class, by ensuring better wages, better real welfare purchasing power of wages, universal basic services, a shorter working week, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, life will be better in every respect, but there will be less commodity production and consumption and less elite accumulation. And so, who are we really fighting here? Who's really the political obstacle? It's the elite class that stands to lose so much from this critique. And that's an obstacle we have to take seriously. And we need the political movements that are commensurate to that task. And for that, we need more than just the environmentalist movement. We need environmentalists in alliance with working class formations, and importantly, in alliance with Global South social movements who've been demanding this for a very long time.
Big tech has a big problem. Manufacturers are used to just selling us products every couple of years, and they come with a business model which relies on selling more and more tech and creating more and more waste. This is simply unsustainable. It's always been unsustainable, but at this point, in the middle of a climate crisis, it's just completely unsustainable and needs to stop. We are concerned that regulators are acting too late and too slowly, and this is why we came up with a 10-year phone campaign to ask for a real step change in the way regulators are treating these issues. The 10-year phone campaign is one of the initiatives of the European Right to Repair campaign. We are asking the European Union to commit to ambitious regulations when it comes to smartphones and other products. What does that mean? We need devices to last for much longer than they do at the moment. So why is it that manufacturers stop supporting software in the smartphones in our pockets after 2 or 3 years? What about 10 years? What about spare parts? Shouldn't they be available to everyone and not just to authorized repairers for 10 years again? And shouldn't they be a lot more affordable so that devices can last longer? And when people stop using them, someone else can continue using them safely, securely for much longer period of time. E-waste is one of the fastest growing stream of waste across the world, and it keeps growing at 3 to 5% per year. Most people are not aware that the vast majority of the environmental impact of a product happens before we've ever switched it on. Up to 80% of the greenhouse emissions related to our smartphones are produced during the manufacturing. So to slow our impact on the planet, we need to significantly slow our speed of consumption. And the only way to do this is to use the products that we have for much longer. And that's why they need to be more repairable and supported for much longer by manufacturers.
Right now, the existing plan, such as it is to grow the entire economy, all sectors of the economy,
right,
all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them,
right,
indefinitely. Right. This is
people will look back on us as a race and think, what were they thinking?
It's too much. It's irrational, especially in an era of ecological breakdown. So we need to be more rational. And what does that look like? It looks like let's think about what we actually want to improve.
Right.
Okay. Let's think about if we need better public health care, better public transportation, whatever it might be, renewable energy, education, wind power, et cetera. Clearly, we need to expand these sectors, improve that kind of provisioning. But obviously, there are also clearly sectors that are destructive and socially unnecessary or less necessary and need to be actively scaled down. SUV production, private jet production, the commercial airline industry more broadly, industrial beef, fast fashion, advertising, planned obsolescence, the military-industrial complex. There are clearly huge chunks of our economy.
That's quite a list.
That are organized around elite power, elite accumulation, and the interest of capital, not around human needs. So we should be able to distinguish, please. This should not be so difficult. My hope is that this call sort of enlivens the left to recognize its the role that it can play in the 21st century, building a society that is more just, but also more ecological. And the justice side and the ecology side come hand in hand. There's no ecology without justice, and there is no justice without ecology.
Right.
So we must be clear on that, and that is, I think, the direction for progressive movements in the 21st century.
If the left did that now, what does Europe look like in 10 or 15 years?
So what does a post-capitalist society look like?
I didn't say it that way, you did.
So it's a society where we have high-quality, universal public services, not just healthcare and education, which are the standard ones, but public transits, energy, water, internets, housing. The things that people need to live flourishing lives are available to everyone. We have a shorter working week. so that we're, because we need to produce less in the economy, right? Like, think about it. If we're scaling down sections of the economy that we don't actually need, our economy needs less labor. We should consider this to be liberatory, right? Why be worried about that?
Because there's been a drip of right-wing propaganda for an awfully long time to say that is the road to serfdom.
So shorten the working week,
Yeah.
Distribute necessary labor more evenly, introduce a public job guarantee so that everybody who wants to work has access to the training necessary to contribute to the most important collective projects of our generation. Renewable energy,
Yes.
Housing refits, ecological regeneration, regenerative farming, whatever it might be. The things that we know we need to accomplish this decade, that requires a tremendous amount of labor. Let us direct our labor towards that rather than towards producing trinkets that are designed ultimately to enhance the accumulation of the capitalist class.
Right.
So it looks like that. It looks like more free time, more meaningful work, less insecurity of unemployment, less poverty, less misery, less homelessness. In fact, those are eradicated. It's a society, however, that is also significantly less unequal because you've gotten rid of the engines of capital accumulation at this point, right? Through this process of de-enclosure, as I call it. And so you have a lot less inequality and a lot less, ultimately, unnecessary commodity production, okay? So it's slimmed down in terms of our resource and energy use, and yet we live better lives. We've delinked our well-being and our welfare from the imperative of perpetual expansion under capitalism. We have a more rational approach to our social objectives. What do we want to improve? That's what our policy is targeted towards. What do we want to reduce in terms of ecology, ecological impact? Those are our policy objectives, not this abstract GDP growth. And so our politics are more focused, our systems more efficient, our technology is liberated from the constraints of capitalist growthism. That's the vision that we fight for.
And that's the vision and the demarcation, if you like, that you've made in the book. Congratulations on the book, Less is More.
Thanks.
And insofar as your timing, not bad, because there's an urgency now, right? And we have to act. Jason, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.